Good evening, everybody. For this week's assignment of profiling an individual in the postbellum economy, I've chosen to tell you about my great-grandfather. My great-grandfather's life was, as Robert M. Solow described in his essay, Economic History and Economics, quote, an interaction of economic behavior, end quote. And that was based upon what Lawrence Davis, Jonathan Hughes, and Stanley Ryder described in their writings as, quote, various kinds of rolls, lists, records, and these materials can best be used to reconstruct the past, end quote. See, my great-grandfather's life was a combination of family stories passed down by his son, my grandfather, as well as the trail of documents that my great-grandfather left as breadcrumbs as he moved through life. Judah Rohr was born in 1866 in a tiny town in what is now referred to as the Ukraine. Back then, that territory was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and my great-grandfather used to talk to my grandfather, who retold us that my great-grandfather had great fondness for the emperor for the way he treated lowly peasants like him. My great-grandfather was married at the age of 15. This is in 1871. And he moved in with his father-in-law and his new bride. And he was supposed to stay there for 2 years and then move in with his father for 2 years. And then after 4 years, he'd go out on his own and have his own place with his bride and his children. Well, 6 months into that arrangement, his father-in-law said, maybe you should move back in with your father. So instead, my great-grandfather boarded a steamer out of Hamburg, Germany, and he sailed for New York City. We know that due to the documentation left behind in his wake. I'll talk about this in a minute. See, my great-grandfather left behind his father's business of selling beads from a cart. Back then, peasant workers were averaging 88 kopecks annually, where 100 kopecks equal $2. Comparatively, factory workers in major cities like New York were earning between $679 a year annually up to $845 annually. My great-grandfather arrived in New York City prior to the establishment of Ellis Island, so instead of Ellis Island as his landing point, the documentation actually says he landed, quote, the port of New York on December 31st, 1886, and he quickly moved in with family friends who had already arrived first. My great-grandfather first moved in with these friends, and he went to work for these people as a tailor in one of their factories. Documentation shows us that 1 out of every 4 immigrant families took in a boarder at that time to help pay the way. This comes from Shutting Out the Sky, Life in the Tenements in New York, 1880 to 1924. I'll post more of this in the source notes. 6 months after my great-grandfather arrived, he sent for his wife and his daughter, infant daughter, because he was now making enough money to support himself, have his own apartment, and they lived at 260 Delancey Street on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, which he listed here as his place of residence. In the 1890s, a tailor in New York City working a 60-hour week was earning between $14.58 a week and $16.26 a week. My great-grandfather had 2 more children with his first wife, and unfortunately she died of tuberculosis, which was not uncommon. He remarried, had 2 more children. The first of those 2 were my grandfather. I'll post pictures of my great-grandfather and my grandfather with the citations for this. In the 1890s, my great-grandfather actually opened his own tailor shop in Manhattan. He rented a second apartment, and he employed up to a dozen tailors. Back then, the statistics show us that you could rent an apartment like that for $12 to $13 a month, or $4 a room. My grandfather and his employees worked 6 days a week doing contract work. They made vests for suits. Apparently, he made enough money doing so that he could afford a gold pocket watch. This actual gold pocket watch. Now, the reason I mention that is a gold pocket watch at that time was considered a sign that you had established yourself as a middle-class businessman. You can actually hear the ticking. As you can see, it still works. My great-grandfather always paid his workers, and there were times where they were paid and he went home with nothing at the end of the week. But then he started working for Whitty Brothers. Whitty Brothers were located a few blocks away from him on Eldridge Street, and they made high-end suits that were, quote, made out of cashmere and Scottish tweeds. Unfortunately, he contracted tuberculosis in 1916, and he could no longer work. At that point, my grandfather, who was in the 8th grade, dropped out, went to work to support the family. My great-grandfather died in 1920 at the age of 54, and he's buried in Old Montefiore Cemetery in Queens, New York. Thank you very much.